Hey everyone, Two Angry Frogs here, and today we're going to cover our general tips to improve your DPS no matter what class or spec you play. Overall, these are simple changes that you can make, and just having awareness of some of these tips will hopefully help you improve your gameplay. But before we begin, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you always know what we're up to next. And don't forget to join for custom emotes, badges, and more. Now, let's get into it. When it comes to character movement, it's all about efficiency. The more efficient your movement, the more you will have time available to cast abilities. This is especially true for high movement lock specs that do not have a lot of instant cast spells. The most important movement change you can make is strafing with your character. Turning your character or moving your character backwards is a much slower movement than strafing, and can also cause you to turn away from the enemy, which prevents spell casting as most abilities require that you are facing the enemy. If you have not strafed with your character before, it does take some getting used to. I know when I first changed this part of my gameplay, it took multiple hours of play and low difficulty content to get used to it. To change this, you will need to reset keybinds to the keys you want to use for strafe. I personally use the A and D keys since those were already the default keybind for turning your character. Angry Frog 2 uses Q, E, and tilde for all of their movement. They never walk backward with their character. How they ended up with that keybind combination, I will never know. But regardless, use the keybinds that are most comfortable and feel more natural for you. Keybinding your abilities limits cursor movement you need to make to get to any of those abilities. This prevents you from needing to move your cursor from enemies and enemy packs to your action bars. You do not have to bind every ability to a key, but definitely focus on those that you use most often. At a minimum, you should keybind any ability that is included in your rotation. If you are able to, try and also keybind your big offensive and big defensive cooldown. And with your keybinds, try to keep them all in a central location to keep from having to move your hand to keys that are far from your movement keys. For example, mapping an often used ability to the K key is likely out of range of your movement keys and leads to a lot of unnecessary hand movement. Like with moving your character, it's about efficiency. As we talked about in our How to Learn New Classes Fast video, there is commonality across all classes and specs in WoW when it comes to our abilities. Mapping an ability type to a specific key and then using that same pattern for every character is a way to build muscle memory when you play any of your characters and get you used to hitting that key. With WoW being a role-playing game, there are particular mindsets that us gamers have developed when it comes to these types of games. First, we tend to hold on to things in our inventory much more than we need to because you never know if and when you might need that particular item. More importantly, we tend to save our big damage abilities for bosses and particularly difficult enemies. It's this mindset that you should change when it comes to World of Warcraft. For most damage burst cooldowns across specs and classes, your cooldown time will be between 2 to 3 minutes. In a given max level dungeon, we'll spend roughly 18 to 24 minutes in the dungeon, maybe a bit more at times depending on the difficulty. If you're holding your big cooldown for bosses, you will cast it at most 4 times, and in some dungeons only 3. Given the time in a routine dungeon and the time for the cooldown, you could be hitting that big damage burst 6 to 12 times. It might seem counterintuitive at first, but you should be using your cooldowns as often as possible to improve your overall DPS. You might be surprised how quickly your big damage cooldown is usable again once you start using it when it's available. Before we finish this tip, know that there definitely are times in which you want to hold the cooldown for a few seconds. For example, if you're trying to line it up with another ability for your specs rotation, or you're holding it a few seconds for the next big enemy pack pull. But if you are routinely holding your cooldowns for 30 seconds, that is 99% of the time too long. There's a common theme when it comes to all classes and specs and their rotations, and that is the ABC of the rotation will always be casting. If you think about it, it's pretty straightforward. Whenever you're not casting an ability, you're not doing damage. There are 2 aspects to this. The first is casting itself, and the movement and keybinding tips directly relate to this. As we talked about earlier, the more efficient your movement, the more time you have for casting abilities, and knowing where you map or keybind specific abilities frees you from another thing you have to think about while dealing with enemy mechanics. Another important thing to note here is that it is better to cast something even if it is a mistake in your rotation. You're better off casting anything than nothing. If you do get out of line with your rotation, just go back to the beginning and start from there to get the rotation going again. The second part to this is ensuring that whatever you start casting, you can finish. Make sure you will not have to move your character before completing that 1.5 second or 2 second cast. Interrupting your spell casting is the same thing as not casting anything at all, and you lose valuable casting time if you are routinely interrupting your abilities. Okay, this seems pretty obvious, I know, but if you're dead, you're doing 0 damage. And not dying comes down to knowing enemy mechanics and casting cooldowns. Knowing the enemy mechanics is crucial. You want to be able to anticipate what you will need to do before an enemy ability is cast. There's a lot of different resources available in text, graphic, and video formats that you can reference before and after enemy fights to understand the mechanics. Then comes in the experience factor that simply cannot be replaced. I know for myself, I look at the in-game journal for boss mechanics and maybe some guides prior to a given boss fight, but I have to experience it to fully understand what is required for a given mechanic. You want to get to the point in any boss fight that you know what mechanic is coming when, and what abilities you have that can be used to counterplay that mechanic. In addition to knowing enemy mechanics, we go back to using cooldowns. As with our big damage offensive cooldowns, you should be using your defensive cooldowns whenever they are needed. Many players tend to hold these entirely too long. Anytime you die in a given encounter, look at your spell bars and make a mental note if you had any defensives available. If you tend to hold defensives, it might surprise you how often a death could have been prevented, so use those defensive abilities. You may at times simply run out of defensive options, but for the additional time you were alive from using defensives, you were doing damage, and that can be the difference between a group defeating or not defeating a boss. There are some basic macros that can increase your DPS due to requiring less steps when casting abilities. Two very important macro types are the @player and @cursor. Using @player in the macro will cast that ability at your feet, and using @cursor will cast where your mouse pointer is at. The @cursor is particularly useful for those spells that require you to place a reticle in an area where the ability is to be cast. By using an @cursor macro, you reduce the ability cast to 1 step, simply hitting the keybind to cast the ability. The @player macro is useful for those abilities that you want to cast at your feet. For example, Destruction Warlock Shadow Fury stuns all enemies in an 8-yard radius. This allows me to run in and stun all enemies by simply clicking the mouse button I have bound to Shadow Fury. For the next type of macro, let's very quickly talk about the global cooldown. The global cooldown, or GCD, is basically a built-in wait timer for casting abilities. The global cooldown starts as soon as you cast an ability, and for most specs is 1.5 seconds. But there are a few specs that are on a 1-second GCD. So for example, if I cast an instant, such as the Frost Mage Ice Lance ability, I must wait 1.5 seconds before I can start the cast of another ability. The GCD can be reduced by your haste level, but cannot be reduced below 0.75 seconds. So why does this matter for macros? Well, there are some abilities, such as those tied to racials and trinkets, that are not on the global cooldown and can be cast at any time. This is where we can apply the use and cast macros. This enables us to tie our racial or trinket abilities to other spells that we cast. So for example, on Aku, I've tied out the Magor Orc racial ability Ancestral Call to Bestial Wrath. So if Ancestral Call racial ability is off cooldown, it will automatically cast when I cast the next Bestial Wrath. For trinkets, you specify the trinket used by the gear slot number. Trinket 1, which is your top trinket, is gear slot 13, and Trinket 2, which is your bottom trinket, is gear slot 14. For trinkets, it's typically best to tie them to big cooldowns, since many of them will be on the same cooldown timer, such as Call of the Wild and Witherbark's Branch, both being 2-minute cooldowns. Note that you can also apply the cast macro for abilities as long as they are not on the global cooldown. For example, for Marksmanship Hunter, we tie our Salvo ability to be cast when we cast Volley. The last macro we will touch on is the @mouseover macro. This can be useful for casting abilities against a target when you have your mouse over the enemy nameplate. This will cast the ability against that mouse over target without it changing your selected enemy. For example, for Beast Mastery, this is very handy for multi-dotting barbed shots, or casting a quick kill shot if a given enemy in a pack is below 20% health. Finally, setting up your user interface so everything is in your direct view can be helpful. Depending on the monitor size you're playing on, different parts of your user interface can be spread far enough apart that it forces you to look away from the gameplay to see important information. Try to place the important information you will need directly in your view so you do not have to context switch and lose focus on what you are doing and your rotation. For example, while getting DPS info is great, it's not relevant while you are fighting a boss. So place it somewhere where it's not obstructing your view of the gameplay. Our ability to customize the WoW user interface has come a long way over the years, and you can save your UI layouts now, so definitely take advantage of this. If you have not used the customization options, you can get to these through the edit mode in the main menu. For myself, as far as user interface, I prefer to keep everything I need in a minimal area in the middle bottom of the screen. This allows me to see important class resources and cooldowns, my health and enemy health, warnings and mechanic countdowns from deadly boss mods, and so on. Everything I need is right in front of me. There are many small adjustments you can make, regardless of the class or spec you play, to improve your DPS and overall gameplay. Most of these are easy adjustments, and some take a little time getting used to, but combined these changes can make a big change in your DPS. We hope these tips help you improve your play, and if there are other tips that you all have, definitely let us know down below in the comments. And everyone, have a great day.